A racist manager is upset that a black man is hired because he thinks the black man is just a diversity hire, so he constantly makes racist comments while playing them off as jokes. However, he gets karma when the black man is announced as the new CEO and reveals he has been undercover the entire time. Eli James stepped through the glass doors of Walton Industries, a calm expression on his face as he took in the sleek, modern office space. This wasn't just his first day on the job. It was the start of an investigation. Eli wasn't here to be just another employee in a cubicle. In a few short weeks, he'd be sitting at the top as the new CEO. But before that happened, he needed to see how this company really worked from the inside. Jim Hartman, the company's founder, had brought Eli in to turn things around. The rumors of discrimination and toxic workplace culture had been swirling for months, and the board knew something had to change. But Eli wasn't the kind of leader to step in without understanding the root of the problem. That's why he was starting here, undercover, as just another new hire. No one knew his real identity, and that was exactly how Eli wanted it. As he approached the elevators, the receptionist didn't look up, too focused on her computer. Employees passed by with brief glances, but no one paid him any real attention. Just another new face in the crowd. Perfect. When he arrived on the second floor, he was greeted by Brad Thompson, the manager who'd been assigned to him. Brad was tall, with slicked back hair, and the kind of smirk that made it clear he thought highly of himself. Eli could sense the arrogance before the man even spoke. "Eli James?" Brad asked, his handshake more forceful than friendly. "That's right," Eli replied, keeping his tone even. Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, and the corners of his mouth twitched. "Welcome to the team. You'll be working under me in management. We like to keep things moving quickly around here. Can't afford to have anyone slowing us down." Eli gave a small nod. "I'm sure I'll keep up." Brad's eyes swept over Eli's face, lingering just a little too long. "We don't get too many new hires like you around here." The words hung in the air, casual enough to pass as polite, but loaded with meaning. Eli didn't react. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Too many times, in fact. But he wasn't here to get into confrontations just yet. "I'm sure I'll fit right in." Brad gave a tight smile, clearly pleased with his own comment. "We'll see. Follow me." As they walked through the office, Eli noticed how Brad made no effort to introduce him to the rest of the team. The few employees they passed barely looked up, their focus on their screens or their phones. The environment was cold, impersonal, just what Eli had expected. Finally, they arrived at a small cubicle tucked away in the corner of the floor, far from the other desks. Brad gestured to the cramped space with a flourish. "This'll be your spot. You'll start with data entry and cross-checking reports. Simple stuff. Think you can handle that?" Eli sat down, his expression calm. "Absolutely." Brad crossed his arms, clearly enjoying this little display of authority. "Good. We run a tight ship here, and I expect my team to be efficient." "No excuses." Eli simply nodded, logging into the system as Brad turned and walked away without another word. As Eli skimmed through the files, he barely paid attention to the work in front of him. His focus was on the bigger picture, the company culture, the subtle power plays, and the clear signs of discrimination that were already emerging. This company had problems, deep ones, and Brad was just the tip of the iceberg. Eli had known going in that Walton Industries had a reputation for being an old boys club, a place where people like Brad thrived while others were pushed to the margins. That was why he was here, to see it all up close, to gather the evidence, and to fix it from the inside out. In a few weeks, when he revealed who he really was, there'd be no more hiding for people like Brad. For now, though, Eli would play his part, the quiet, competent new hire. He'd bide his time, keep his head down, and watch. Because when he finally stepped into the CEO's office, he wasn't just going to change the company. He was going to dismantle the toxic culture that people like Brad had helped create. And Brad had no idea what was coming. As the day came to a close, Eli leaned back in his chair, watching as the office emptied around him. He was just another employee for now, but not for long. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Eli arrived early the next day, slipping into his small cubicle before the rest of the office filled up. The hum of computers and the soft clatter of keyboards soon surrounded him as employees began their day. To everyone else, he was just another entry-level worker, assigned to handle the tedious reports and grunt work that Brad didn't want to bother with. But Eli wasn't here for the reports. His real task was beginning. Brad arrived late as usual, strolling in with the air of someone who believed they owned the place. Eli watched him from the corner of his eye, noticing how the team tensed slightly when Brad passed by. His presence loomed, not in a way that inspired respect, but in a way that signaled discomfort. Eli had seen this before, a boss who thrived on intimidation. "James," Brad called out, snapping Eli's attention back to him. Brad was standing by his desk, a stack of papers in hand. Eli calmly stood and approached. "Yes?" Brad handed him the papers without bothering to look up from his phone. "I need you to cross-check these reports with last month's figures. The data's in the system, and I expect it done by noon. No errors." Eli took the papers, glancing through them. The task was basic and mind-numbing, something that could have been automated in minutes. Brad clearly didn't think much of his abilities. "I'll have it done." Brad gave him a half smile, as though expecting Eli to struggle. "Good. Keep me updated." As Brad walked away, Eli returned to his desk, sitting down and flipping through the reports. He knew Brad was watching him, waiting for him to fail. But Eli was always one step ahead. He finished the task with ease, using the extra time to observe the interactions between Brad and the rest of the team. Brad ruled over his group with a kind of passive-aggressive dominance. There were no direct insults, no outright confrontations, just small slights, sarcastic remarks, and veiled critiques that slowly chipped away at morale. When one of the younger employees, Matt, asked for clarification on a project, Brad leaned over his desk, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you need me to hold your hand through every task, Matt?" Brad asked, loud enough for the entire office to hear. "I thought we hired adults around here." Matt flushed, stammering an apology. "No, I just wanted to make sure." "Well, maybe pay more attention next time," Brad interrupted. "I'm not here to babysit." Eli watched the exchange, noting how quickly Matt retreated, his confidence crushed. It was subtle, but it was constant. Eli had no doubt that Brad's behavior was one of the reasons morale was low and turnover high. Brad treated his position like a throne, and everyone else was just there to serve him. A few hours later, Eli approached Brad's office to submit his completed reports. The door was open, and Brad sat behind his desk, scrolling through his phone, clearly unconcerned with the work he'd delegated. Eli knocked lightly on the frame. "All done," Eli said, holding out the reports. Brad barely glanced at him, his fingers still swiping across his screen. "That was fast. You sure it's right?" "Positive," Eli replied calmly. Brad finally looked up, narrowing his eyes as if he didn't quite believe Eli. He snatched the papers from his hand, flipping through them quickly. "We'll see. If there's a single mistake, I'll hear about it." Eli said nothing, just stood there, letting Brad feel as though he still had the upper hand. It was clear Brad didn't think much of him yet. Just another worker doing what he was told, and that was fine, for now. Later that day, the team gathered for a quick meeting in the conference room. Eli took a seat in the back, quietly observing as Brad led the session. He presented the agenda with his usual air of superiority, making offhand comments that made the team shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "We've got some new hires coming in soon," Brad said, glancing briefly in Eli's direction. "I'm hoping we don't get stuck with any diversity hires this time." A few people chuckled awkwardly, though most just stared at their notebooks, avoiding eye contact. Eli remained silent, his face unreadable. But inside, the comment landed exactly as Brad had intended it to. Eli knew these microaggressions wouldn't be confined to a few comments in meetings. They were part of the company's culture, part of what had been allowed to fester here for too long. Brad and others like him had gotten comfortable, assuming no one would ever challenge them. But soon, that would change. As the meeting wrapped up, Brad gave his usual motivational speech, though it was hardly inspiring. It was filled with self-congratulation and empty platitudes about hard work. Eli left the room with a clearer understanding of what was going on at Walton Industries, but also with a sharper sense of purpose. Brad Thompson wasn't just a bad manager. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the company's toxic culture. And soon, Eli would be in the position to do something about it. For now, he stayed quiet, observing, biding his time. But when the moment came, Brad and others like him wouldn't know what hit them. The next day, Eli received an email from Brad inviting the team to lunch. The message had the usual corporate lingo, team bonding and building connections. But Eli knew Brad had more than that on his mind. Lunch was Brad's way of asserting dominance, and Eli saw this as an opportunity to observe more of the dynamics in play. The restaurant was a short walk from the office, and the team settled around a long table with Brad naturally positioning himself at the head. Eli took a seat toward the far end, blending in with the others, quietly watching as Brad took control of the conversation right from the start. "So, Eli," Brad said after a few minutes, leaning back in his chair with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's it going so far? Getting the hang of things?" Eli nodded. "Everything's going smoothly," Brad chuckled, his tone light but with that familiar edge. "Yeah, it's pretty simple stuff right now. I guess it'll be easier if you don't overthink it. Some people try to do too much, especially when they're new." His gaze lingered on Eli for a second longer than necessary, his message clear. Eli met his gaze calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. I'm comfortable with the pace. Brad shrugged, as if Eli's confidence didn't faze him. Well, good. We like to keep things efficient. No need to complicate things. Eli noticed the way Brad worded his responses. Not overtly insulting, but just subtle enough to hint at his expectations. Brad wanted to make it clear that in his department, everything ran through him, and Eli was just another cog in his machine. The waiter came by, refilling drinks, and the conversation turned to the upcoming changes at the company. One of the team members mentioned rumors about the new CEO, and Brad perked up immediately, clearly ready to share his thoughts. I've been hearing about this new CEO for months now, Brad said, shaking his head as he leaned back. It's all just whispers right now, but you know how it is. People love to speculate. Personally, I hope they don't go too crazy with this whole diversity hire thing. There it was. Just a subtle comment, but it hung in the air, making the conversation awkward for a moment. Some of the team members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared challenge Brad directly. Eli stayed silent, watching. Brad, feeling the silence, quickly added, "Not that I care either way, but let's be honest. What we need is someone who can really handle things. No need for unnecessary changes, right? We've got a good thing going here." Eli noted how Brad casually dismissed the idea of change, especially if that change meant bringing in someone who didn't fit the old mold. His comment wasn't blatant, but it revealed plenty about his mindset and how he viewed people who didn't look like him. The rest of the lunch continued in a similar fashion, with Brad leading the conversation and the rest of the team nodding along politely. Every now and then, Brad would make a comment or joke that had just a hint of exclusion, something that reminded everyone of their place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. As the lunch wrapped up, Brad clapped Eli on the shoulder, flashing him a grin. "Good to have you on board, Eli. Just keep doing what you're doing, and you'll fit right in. No need to rock the boat, you know." Eli gave him a polite smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Back at the office, Eli returned to his desk, his mind replaying the conversation. Brad's attitude was becoming clearer with every interaction. He was comfortable with the status quo and wasn't about to let anyone challenge it, especially not someone like Eli. The subtle comment about a diversity hire spoke volumes, not just about Brad's views, but about the larger culture at Walton Industries. Eli knew he couldn't let his guard down, not yet. Brad saw him as just another employee, someone to be kept in check. But that was going to change soon, very soon. Friday rolled around, and the usual office buzz filled the air as people prepared for the weekend. Brad, true to form, had decided to treat the team to lunch. He made sure everyone knew about it, walking around the office, dropping hints about how generous he was. "Lunch on me, everyone," he'd announced that morning, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. Eli could already tell this was more than just an act of generosity. It was about Brad reasserting his position after their subtle power struggle at the restaurant lunch earlier in the week. Brad had been irked by Eli's calm refusal to rise to his bait, and today felt like another test. By noon, the takeout bags had arrived, and the break room was packed with the team. People milled around the long table, chatting and waiting for Brad to hand out the orders like a king distributing favors. Eli took a seat toward the back, watching as Brad moved through the room with an exaggerated air of authority, passing out food to each person. "Sarah, here's your salad," Brad said with a smile, placing it in front of her. "Matt, burger for you, man. Enjoy." As he worked his way down the table, Brad made a point of stopping when he reached Eli, deliberately holding the bag of food just a little too long. Eli felt the eyes of the team shift toward him, sensing something was about to happen. Brad's grin widened. "And looks like we've got nothing for you, Eli," Brad said, raising his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Sorry, no fried chicken in the order today." The room went silent, the tension thickening as Brad's words hung in the air. Some of the team members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure of how to react. Others kept their heads down, hoping to avoid being dragged into whatever was about to happen. Eli looked at Brad, his face perfectly calm. The joke was thinly veiled, but it wasn't about the food. It was about power. Brad had thrown out the comment expecting a laugh, a way to publicly diminish Eli and remind everyone who was really in control. But Eli wasn't going to let it slide. "What exactly do you mean by that, Brad?" Eli asked, his voice low and steady. Brad's grin faltered for just a moment before he forced a laugh. "Come on, man, it's just a joke. You gotta lighten up, you know. We like to keep things easy going around here." Eli didn't blink. He kept his eyes locked on Brad. "I'm just trying to understand the joke. What's funny about it?" The break room grew even quieter, the air charged with tension. A few of the other employees glanced nervously between Eli and Brad, clearly uncomfortable. Sarah shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking to Brad, waiting to see how he'd handle the pushback. Brad's smile wavered again, but he quickly recovered, trying to play it off. It's just, we're all having fun here. Don't be so serious, Eli. It's nothing personal. Eli leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. I'm not taking it personally. I just don't see what's funny about leaving me out and making that comment. Maybe you can explain it to me. Brad's discomfort was now fully visible. His hand tightened around the edge of the takeout bag, and his usual bravado seemed to shrink in the face of Eli's calm, unflinching demeanor. The break room was deathly silent, with everyone watching the exchange unfold. Look, Brad said, trying to brush it off with a strained laugh. It's just a joke, all right? I didn't mean anything by it. Eli's voice remained calm, but there was a subtle edge now. You seem to make a lot of those jokes, Brad, and they're always aimed in the same direction. Brad's face flushed slightly, and for the first time since Eli had met him, the cracks in his confidence were showing. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room for support, but no one was willing to meet his eyes. Even the few people who usually laughed along with his comments seemed uneasy now. All right, Brad muttered, waving his hand dismissively. Let's just get back to lunch, okay? No need to make a big deal out of nothing. Eli didn't let it go immediately. He let the silence linger just a few seconds longer, enough to make it clear that the conversation wasn't over on his terms. Then, with a slow nod, he leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm. Sure, let's get back to lunch. The break room buzz resumed, but it was different now. The easygoing chatter that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced by a strained quiet. Brad returned to handing out food, his usual swagger noticeably diminished. The rest of the team kept their eyes on their plates, their discomfort palpable. Brad had been humiliated, though most people in the room wouldn't have seen it as a direct confrontation. But Eli knew that Brad felt the sting of it deeply. Brad had tried to assert his dominance in front of the team, and Eli had calmly, methodically, taken that moment away from him. Brad wasn't just the butt of his own failed joke. He was exposed. As the team finished lunch and began to file out of the break room, Brad lingered at the back of the room, his eyes darting toward Eli with barely disguised anger. Eli could feel the tension from across the room. Brad was already thinking of ways to regain control, to strike back. This wouldn't end here. As Eli stood to leave, Brad caught up with him near the door. Look, man, Brad said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the irritation in his voice. Don't take what I said too seriously, all right? It was just a little ribbing. You get how it is around here, right? We all joke around. Eli turned to face him, his expression still unreadable. Sure, I get it. But just so you know, I'm not the kind of person you can rib like that. So, I'd appreciate it if we kept things professional. Brad's eyes flashed with something darker, a mix of frustration and wounded pride. Yeah, sure, professional. Eli nodded once and walked away, leaving Brad standing by the door, his fists clenched at his sides. As Eli made his way back to his desk, he knew that Brad wouldn't take this loss quietly. The man had been publicly embarrassed, and someone like Brad wouldn't let that go easily. Eli had crossed an invisible line, one that would trigger Brad's need for revenge. This wasn't the end of their conflict. Eli could feel it coming, the next move, the retaliation, and when it came, Eli would be ready. But for now, he had won the first round, and everyone in the office had seen it. By Monday morning, the atmosphere in the office had shifted. The break room incident had left its mark. Though few spoke about it directly, Eli could feel the change in the air, the way people glanced at him with a mix of respect and curiosity. The subtle tension between him and Brad hadn't gone unnoticed. In fact, it seemed to ripple through the entire team, who now moved a little more carefully around Brad, perhaps sensing that the balance of power had shifted, however slightly. Brad, however, was not the type to lick his wounds quietly. Eli knew Brad was brewing something. The man hadn't spoken to him directly since the break room lunch, but his presence felt heavier, more deliberate. Brad's eyes lingered on Eli during meetings, and his footsteps seemed to echo louder when he passed by Eli's desk. It was as if Brad was trying to reassert himself, to remind Eli and the team who was in charge. But Eli could see through the facade. The first sign of trouble came mid-morning when Eli was handed a new project by Brad. It was dropped onto his desk, with the same casual disregard Brad had shown before. But this time, Eli could sense the intention behind it. Need this done by end of day, Brad said, barely making eye contact. Shouldn't be too hard, but make sure it's right. No room for mistakes. His tone was clipped, the words precise, as if he were daring Eli to slip up. Eli glanced at the documents. It was a routine data comparison project, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. but Brad's deliberate vagueness about the instructions set off alarms. The reports were disorganized, and several key pieces of information were missing. Pieces Eli would need in order to complete the work accurately. Brad had set him up to fail. Eli looked up. Some of these data points are missing. Do you have the source files for these? Brad's eyes narrowed just slightly before he gave a shrug. Everything should be in there. If it's not, you'll just have to figure it out. It was a deliberate challenge. Brad was making it clear that if Eli didn't perform perfectly under these less-than-ideal conditions, he would be the one to suffer the consequences. It wasn't just about the work. It was about Brad trying to regain control after the embarrassment of the fried chicken comment. Eli didn't blink. He nodded slowly and said, "I'll have it done." Brad's smirk returned for just a second, as if he believed he had gained the upper hand. Good. I'll be checking it carefully. Eli set to work, sifting through the disorganized reports, cross-referencing the available data, and doing his best to fill in the gaps that Brad had intentionally left. It was tedious, and the missing information made the task much harder than it needed to be. But Eli knew that this was just another game. Brad was testing him, waiting for him to make a mistake. By early afternoon, Sarah from HR stopped by Eli's desk. Sarah Jenkins had become a quiet but important ally for Eli over the last few weeks. She was sharp, observant, and someone who had her own frustrations with how the company was being run. They had crossed paths more frequently as Eli took on more projects, and while she didn't know his real role in the company, she seemed to sense that Eli was someone different, someone who could see through the layers of dysfunction that plagued Walton Industries. Sarah had hinted in passing conversations that she wasn't a fan of Brad's style of management, though she'd been careful not to say too much. HR had its limits, especially in a company that didn't take its own policies seriously. Still, Eli appreciated Sarah's discretion and her willingness to give him a heads up when things were off. Today, her expression was more cautious than usual. She leaned against the cubicle wall, her voice low enough so only Eli could hear. Brad's been on edge since Friday, she said carefully. Just keep an eye out. Eli didn't break his focus from the report. I noticed. He's setting me up. Sarah glanced around the office before speaking again. I wouldn't say this to just anyone, but he's done this before. You're not the first person he's tried to throw under the bus. Eli nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Thanks for the heads up. Sarah lingered for a moment longer, then added quietly, just be careful. Brad's vindictive. He doesn't like to lose. Eli watched her leave, his mind already strategizing. He'd expected this. Brad wasn't the type to accept being challenged, especially not publicly, and now he was trying to reassert his dominance by undermining Eli's work. But Eli had no intention of letting Brad win this round. As the hours ticked by, Eli worked meticulously, combing through the reports, double-checking every figure, and triple-checking the details that were intentionally left incomplete. It wasn't easy, and the frustration of dealing with deliberately missing information was mounting. But Eli kept calm, knowing that Brad was expecting him to crack. By late afternoon, the report was finished. Eli stood, gathering the documents and walking over to Brad's office. The door was slightly ajar, and Brad was sitting at his desk, leaning back in his chair as if he hadn't a care in the world. Eli knocked lightly and stepped inside. Here's the report, he said, placing it on Brad's desk. Brad raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that Eli had finished early. Already? That was quick. He picked up the report, flipping through the pages, looking for something, anything, that he could use against Eli. Eli stood calmly, watching as Brad skimmed the data, his eyes narrowing with each page. He wasn't finding the errors he'd hoped for. Brad's jaw tightened as he closed the folder. I'll review it more thoroughly later, he said, his tone dismissive, though the tension in his voice was evident. Eli didn't respond, simply nodding before turning to leave. As he walked back to his desk, Eli knew that this wasn't over. Brad would be waiting for any opportunity to tear him down, to make him look incompetent in front of the team. But Eli was patient. He knew that the more Brad tried to sabotage him, the more the man would reveal his true nature to the rest of the office. And in the end, Brad wouldn't just be dealing with Eli, he'd be dealing with the new CEO. The office had returned to its usual hum of activity, but the tension between Eli and Brad had reached a new peak. After the break room incident and the back and forth over the fake errors in the report, Eli knew Brad wouldn't let things go. Brad was the type to nurse a grudge, and now, more than ever, he was determined to make Eli pay for challenging him publicly. By the middle of the week, Brad found his opening. It was another data report similar to the one before, but this time Brad had set things up more carefully. The project came with an urgent deadline, and included multiple files from different departments that Eli was supposed to cross-check. On the surface, it seemed routine, just tedious enough to slow Eli down, but not complex enough to raise any suspicions. Eli started working on it right away, going through the data methodically. But as he progressed, he began to notice inconsistencies in the information. Some of the files didn't match up, and the numbers seemed off. At first, Eli thought it might just be sloppy work from one of the other departments. But the deeper he went, the more deliberate the discrepancies appeared. The problem wasn't just in the data, it was in the way Brad had set it up. He had structured the files in such a way that the errors wouldn't be immediately noticeable, but they would show up in the final report once everything was compiled. Eli would have no way to catch them all without access to the original source files, which Brad had conveniently forgotten to send. Eli's frustration grew as he tried to make sense of the mess. By the time he realized how intentional the sabotage was, the deadline was looming, and there was no time to request the missing information without looking like he was stalling. Brad had planned it perfectly. Eli submitted the report on time, knowing that the errors Brad had planted would come to light the moment it was reviewed. He had no choice. If he didn't submit it, Brad would claim he had missed the deadline, and if he did submit it, the mistakes would be pinned on him. Sure enough, the fallout came swiftly. The next morning, an email arrived from Brad, but this time, it wasn't just an internal matter. He had looped in several senior managers, along with the department head, making sure everyone saw Eli's supposed failure. Eli, it looks like the report you submitted yesterday contains multiple errors. These discrepancies need to be addressed immediately. Given the importance of this data, this is a serious issue that can't be overlooked. Please make the necessary corrections as soon as possible. Copying senior management to keep them informed. Brad Thompson. The email hit Eli like a blow. This wasn't a subtle power move. It was a calculated attack meant to discredit him in front of the entire leadership team. Brad had effectively thrown Eli under the bus, and he had the full attention of senior management on his side. Eli sat at his desk, staring at the email. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, the quiet conversations that had started around the office. Brad had framed this perfectly. Any protest from Eli would just look like an excuse. Eli took a deep breath and stood. He knew he couldn't let this slide. If he didn't confront Brad now, the man would continue to sabotage him until Eli was backed into a corner. This had gone far enough. He walked straight to Brad's office, ignoring the curious looks from his coworkers. Brad was sitting at his desk, pretending to be busy, but Eli knew he'd been waiting for this. Without knocking, Eli stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Brad, we need to talk." Brad looked up, feigning surprise. "Eli, something wrong?" Eli didn't bother with pleasantries. "You sabotaged that report. The data you gave me was incomplete, and you set me up to fail." Brad leaned back in his chair, his smirk slowly forming. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Eli. You sure you want to go down that road?" Eli crossed his arms, his voice steady but firm. "I know what you did. You set up the files to make sure the numbers wouldn't match, and now you're trying to pin the errors on me." Brad's smirk grew wider. He stood up slowly, walking around his desk to stand directly in front of Eli. "Even if that were true, which of course it's not, do you really think anyone's going to believe you?" Eli's jaw clenched. "I can prove it. I have the original versions of the files you sent me." Brad chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Eli, you still don't get it, do you? No one cares about your proof. I've been here a long time and people trust me. You're just the new guy. They're not going to take your word over mine." Brad's voice dropped lower, his tone dripping with condescension. "No one is going to believe you. Not the senior managers, not the department head, no one. As far as they're concerned, you're the one who screwed up. I made sure of that." Eli stared at him, his fists tightening at his sides. Brad's arrogance was infuriating, but Eli knew he was right about one thing. Brad had spent years building relationships and manipulating people. It wouldn't be easy to convince senior management that Brad had set him up. The company's internal culture favored people like Brad, and Eli was still the outsider. But Eli wasn't backing down. "You think you've won," Eli said, his voice calm despite the anger boiling underneath. "But this isn't over. You can try to undermine me all you want, but I'm not going anywhere." Brad raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "We'll see about that." Eli didn't respond. He turned and left the office, feeling the weight of the confrontation settling on his shoulders. Brad had managed to pull off his sabotage this time, and the damage was done. But Eli wasn't finished. As he walked back to his desk, Eli knew he had to be smarter, more strategic. Brad had connections and influence, but Eli had something more powerful. He had the truth, and he had the backing of the company's founder. Brad might have won this round, but Eli was playing the long game. And when the time came, Brad wouldn't just be facing a frustrated colleague, he'd be facing the new CEO. Eli sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, though his mind was far from the numbers and reports in front of him. The email from Brad earlier in the day lingered in his thoughts, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it signified. Brad had made his move, and it had been a successful one. The public takedown of Eli, the manipulation of the report. Brad had achieved exactly what he wanted, to discredit Eli in front of senior management. Eli took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair as he watched the hum of the office around him. The team worked quietly, heads down, avoiding eye contact as they moved about their daily tasks. He could feel the subtle shift in the air. People were whispering, talking, wondering whether Eli would recover from this. That's how the corporate world worked. One slip, one crack in your reputation, and the vultures started circling. But Eli hadn't come this far to let Brad win. His mind drifted back to the reasons he'd taken this job in the first place. He hadn't come to Walton Industries just for a paycheck. Jim Hartman, the company's founder, had handpicked Eli for this role because he saw the company's future in him. Eli wasn't here to play the long game of office politics like Brad had been doing for years. He was here to rebuild the company from the inside out, to expose the rot at its core and reshape it into something better. He'd agreed to go undercover to see the real culture, to understand how things operated before stepping into the CEO position. And now, after weeks of observing Brad's manipulative behavior, seeing how toxic the office environment was, Eli knew exactly what needed to change. Brad wasn't just a bad manager. He was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that ran deep in Walton Industries. This was the kind of office culture where people like Brad thrived, where power games and manipulation went unchecked. Eli's thoughts moved to his next step, the upcoming CEO announcement. He had stayed in the shadows long enough. It had been part of the plan to observe the company culture firsthand, but now, more than ever, it was clear that he had to take his place at the top. Brad had no idea who Eli really was. To Brad, Eli was just another employee he could crush under his heel, but that would change soon. In a few short days, the company would officially announce the new CEO, and Brad, along with everyone else, would finally see who Eli really was. The thought brought a sense of calm and resolve to Eli. The games Brad had been playing wouldn't matter once the announcement was made. All of his sabotage, the attempts to discredit Eli, would unravel the moment Eli stepped into his new role. For now, Eli remained patient. He wasn't here to make emotional moves or to fight Brad in the trenches of office drama. He had a bigger plan, one that stretched far beyond petty power struggles. Once he was in the CEO's office, Brad would have to answer for everything he had done, not just to Eli, but to the company. The question that lingered in Eli's mind, however, was whether Brad even realized the kind of person he was up against. In all of his arrogance, Brad likely saw Eli as a temporary threat, someone he could erase from the corporate landscape with a few well-placed emails and accusations. But Brad didn't know that the real threat was Eli's quiet confidence, his ability to bide his time and strike when it mattered most. Eli glanced around the office, the faces of his co-workers flashing through his mind. Many of them had been living in this toxic environment for years, adjusting to Brad's manipulative ways because they didn't have the power to challenge him. But soon, they would have a new leader, someone who wouldn't tolerate the kind of behavior that had festered for so long. Eli thought of Sarah, her cautious warning still fresh in his mind. She had seen how things operated here for years, and she had given him the insight he needed to understand just how deep the issues ran. He stood up from his desk, looking out over the floor where his co-workers worked silently. Change was coming, whether they knew it or not. This company was about to face a reckoning, and Brad would be at the center of it. Eli walked to the large windows at the back of the office, gazing out over the city skyline. He felt a sense of quiet anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Everything was about to change, and soon, Walton Industries would be under his leadership. There would be no more Brad Thompsons manipulating their way to the top, no more toxic power games that undermined talented people, no more whispers of incompetence designed to ruin careers. Eli's grip tightened on the windowsill as he made a silent vow. The company would be different. He would make sure of it. The CEO announcement was just days away, and when it came, Brad wouldn't be able to hide behind his lies anymore. He would have to face the truth, and Eli would be the one to deliver it. The day had finally arrived. Walton Industries was buzzing with anticipation, though most of the employees had no idea why. An email had gone out earlier that morning, calling everyone to gather in the large conference room for an important company-wide announcement. Speculation rippled through the office as people exchanged curious glances, wondering what the big news could be. Eli sat at his desk, calm and focused. He could feel the energy shifting around him, but it didn't affect him. For weeks, he had played the role of the quiet, diligent employee, observing the culture and behavior of those around him. But today, that role would come to an end. Brad, on the other hand, seemed more agitated than usual. Eli had noticed it throughout the morning. Brad pacing around his office, checking his phone, throwing occasional glances in Eli's direction. He must have sensed something was off, though Brad couldn't have known just how seismic the shift was about to be. A few minutes before the announcement, Jim Hartman, the founder of the company, walked onto the office floor, his usual friendly demeanor tinged with an air of authority. Jim was well-liked, respected even, but it was no secret that the company had lost its way in recent years. That's why he had hired Eli in the first place, to turn things around. Jim's voice carried easily across the office floor as he greeted employees. He paused briefly at Brad's desk, exchanging pleasantries before moving on. Brad, trying to play it cool, threw a glance in Eli's direction. Eli gave him a polite nod, keeping his expression neutral. The moment was almost here. "Let's gather in the conference room," Jim called out to the team. "We've got an important announcement to make." The office moved as one, employees filing toward the conference room, the buzz of conversation growing louder as people speculated about what was happening. Eli walked alongside them, his mind calm, though his heart beat a little faster with anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Inside the large conference room, everyone took their seats, filling the space quickly. Jim stood at the front, looking out over the team, his presence commanding but approachable. Brad stood off to the side, still wearing his smug grin, though it was clear he had no idea what was coming. To him, this was probably just another routine company update. Jim cleared his throat and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," Jim began. "I know there's been a lot of talk around the office recently about changes coming to Walton Industries, and today I'm here to announce one of the most important changes we've made in a long time." He paused, letting the anticipation build. "For some time now, we've been looking to bring in a new CEO, someone who can lead this company into the future with fresh ideas and strong leadership. And today, I'm proud to introduce that person." The room was silent, eyes wide with curiosity. Brad, still standing near the front, looked relaxed, probably thinking that whoever the new CEO was, he could charm his way into their good graces like he had with so many others. Jim smiled, turning slightly toward the audience. "I'm pleased to announce that Eli James will be stepping into the role of CEO of Walton Industries." A wave of stunned silence swept across the room. Brad's face froze, his smug expression faltering into confusion, then shock. His eyes locked on Eli as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Eli stood, his heart pounding as he walked toward the front of the room. All eyes were on him now, and he could feel the weight of the moment. This was what he had been working toward, the moment where everything would change. As Eli stepped up next to Jim, he could feel Brad's stare burning into him. Brad's face had turned pale, his mouth slightly open as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The man who he had tried to sabotage, humiliate, and destroy was now standing at the front of the room as his new boss. Jim clapped Eli on the back, his voice booming with pride. "Eli brings a wealth of experience and a fresh perspective to this role, and I have full confidence that he will lead Walton Industries into a new era of success and growth." I've had the privilege of getting to know Eli personally over the past few months, and I can tell you, we're in good hands. The room remained stunned, the weight of the announcement sinking in. Eli turned to face the employees, his calm expression hiding the emotions running through him. "Thank you, Jim," Eli began, his voice steady. "It's an honor to step into this role. Over the past few weeks, I've had the chance to observe the incredible talent and hard work that make this company what it is. But I haven't been doing it from the outside." He paused, watching the crowd shift uncomfortably. "I've been working undercover," Eli continued, letting the words sink in. "I was brought into this company not as the CEO you see today, but as a regular employee, so I could understand the culture firsthand. So I could see how things really worked around here, how people were treated, how leadership managed the team, and where improvements needed to be made." The room was completely silent now. People exchanged glances, the realization dawning on them that the man they had thought was just another worker had been observing everything, taking notes, seeing their true behaviors. "I've seen a lot during my time here," Eli said, his eyes sweeping the room. "I've seen the incredible talent and dedication of many of you, but I've also seen things that need to change. Attitudes, behaviors, and practices that have no place in a company that values integrity and respect." His gaze landed on Brad, who was staring at Eli with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. Brad's hands clenched at his sides, his usual smug demeanor crumbling under the weight of what was happening. I want to make something very clear, Eli continued, his voice firm. Under my leadership, Walton Industries will be a place where respect, accountability, and fairness are the foundation of everything we do. There will be no room for manipulation, sabotage, or mistreatment of employees. The message was clear. Though Eli didn't say Brad's name, everyone knew who he was talking about. Brad's face flushed red, and his fists clenched tighter. He had lost control of the room, of the company, and now, he knew it. Jim stepped forward again, beaming. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm excited for what the future holds under Eli's leadership. Let's give him a warm welcome. The room erupted into applause, though the shock still lingered in the air. Some of the employees clapped enthusiastically, while others, especially those closest to Brad, looked uneasy. Brad stood rigid, unable to mask the fury and fear now brewing beneath the surface. As the applause died down, Eli took one last look around the room, his gaze once again finding Brad. Their eyes locked, and Eli gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The tables had turned. Brad had no idea what was coming next. But one thing was certain. His reign of manipulation and sabotage was over. Eli smiled as he stepped down from the front of the room, ready to begin his new role. The game had only just begun. The next morning, the office was buzzing. News of Eli's CEO appointment had spread like wildfire, and people were still adjusting to the idea that the quiet, unassuming new hire had been watching them all along. But there was one person in particular who hadn't shown his face much since the announcement. Brad. Eli had called Brad into his office that morning for what would be their final meeting. Eli knew this confrontation wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Brad had to answer for his actions, his manipulation, his sabotage, and the toxic environment he had fostered for years. The door to Eli's office opened and Brad walked in, a mix of barely concealed anger and forced professionalism on his face. His usual swagger was gone, replaced with something darker, more desperate. He knew why he was here, but there was still a flicker of hope in his eyes, as if he thought he could talk his way out of it. Eli stood behind his desk, looking calm and collected as he gestured toward the chair across from him. Brad, have a seat. We need to talk. Brad hesitated for a moment before sitting down. His eyes darted around the office, lingering on the folder sitting on Eli's desk, a growing sense of unease creeping into his features. What's this about? Brad asked, though his voice betrayed the fact that he already knew. Eli leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. It's about your behavior. Specifically, your actions over the past few weeks. And frankly, the past few years. Brad's eyes narrowed. If this is about the complaints, those are nonsense. People didn't like how I ran things, but I've done nothing wrong. I've been with this company a long time, and I've earned my place here. Eli didn't flinch. He opened the folder, revealing pages of reports and documentation, detailing years of complaints against Brad. I've gone through every single one of these complaints, Brad, and they all tell the same story. You've manipulated, bullied, and sabotaged people for years. Brad scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. Come on, Eli. You've been here what? A few months? You don't know how this place works. People like to exaggerate when they don't get their way. Eli raised an eyebrow, his voice remaining steady. I know exactly how this place works, Brad. I've spent weeks observing it firsthand, and I've seen the way you operate. The way you control people with fear. The way you use your position to undermine those who challenge you. Brad's smirk faltered, but he tried to hold his ground. This is all hearsay. You don't have any real proof. Eli's eyes hardened as he pushed the file closer to Brad. I've got more than enough proof. Complaints that were swept under the rug. Reports that were ignored because you had people convinced they couldn't touch you. Brad's face tightened, but Eli wasn't finished. And let's not forget your most recent stunt, Eli continued, his voice sharper now. You sabotaged that report, Brad. You gave me incomplete data and then tried to frame me for the errors. You wanted to make me look incompetent in front of senior management. Brad's face flushed red with anger, but Eli wasn't giving him any room to escape. You deliberately set me up to fail. But what you didn't count on was that I had the original files. I could prove you altered the data. Brad stood abruptly, his fists clenched, rage radiating from him. This is ridiculous. You think you can just walk in here, throw out a few accusations, and have everyone believe you? Eli remained seated, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Brad's outburst. You can deny it all you want, but we both know the truth. You've been manipulating people for years, and now it's over. Brad's face twisted with fury, his voice rising. No one's going to believe you. I've been here for years. I know these people better than you ever will. You're just some new guy who thinks he can come in and change everything. You don't have the clout to get rid of me. Eli finally stood, meeting Brad's anger with quiet strength. I'm not just some new guy, Brad. I'm the CEO. And I don't need anyone to believe me. The evidence speaks for itself. Brad's expression shifted from rage to desperation. He had always been the one in control, the one pulling the strings. But now, he was faced with someone he couldn't manipulate, someone who had seen through every lie and deception. You can't do this, Brad muttered, his voice wavering. I've put too much into this company. You think you're going to make it better without me? Eli's eyes never left Brad's. I'm going to make it better because you're not going to be here. Your time at Walton Industries is over. Brad's face paled as Eli picked up the file from his desk. I've already spoken to HR. With this documentation, I have more than enough grounds to terminate your employment. Brad's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight as he struggled to find a way out. You can't do this. Eli's voice was calm, but final. It's already done. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Brad stood frozen. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Eli exhaled, the tension of the confrontation still lingering in the room, but it was done. Brad was finished. The first step in rebuilding Walton Industries had been taken. As he sat back down at his desk, Eli knew that there was still much work to do. But for the first time, the company was moving in the right direction. Brad's reign of manipulation and sabotage was over. And this was just the beginning of the changes Eli would bring. The future of Walton Industries was now in his hands, and Eli was ready to lead. The office was quieter than usual as the day came to a close. Eli sat at his desk, watching the sunset bathe the city in a golden glow. His office, once a symbol of the unreachable top, now felt like a space filled with both opportunity and responsibility. The events of the last few weeks played over in his mind, each moment leading to this, his role as the new CEO of Walton Industries. He leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts wander over the path that had brought him here. When Jim Hartman first approached him about going undercover, Eli had known the challenge would be immense. Being the CEO of a company like Walton Industries came with more than just financial or strategic pressures. It meant confronting a deeply embedded culture, one that had allowed people like Brad to thrive unchecked for far too long. Eli hadn't realized just how toxic the environment was until he'd seen it for himself. Working in the trenches alongside the employees had opened his eyes to the subtle and sometimes blatant manipulations that had been happening under the surface. Brad had epitomized everything that was wrong with the culture. His need for control, his willingness to sabotage anyone who stood in his way, and his constant undermining of talented people were all symptoms of a deeper rot. Eli thought back to his early days at the company. At first, people had kept their distance from him, unsure of the quiet new hire who didn't seem to fit the usual mold. But slowly, Eli had gained their trust. He'd learned about the fear they felt working under people like Brad, the way ambition and talent were stifled in favor of ego and power games. The break room incident still stood out in his mind. Brad had thought he could humiliate Eli with a casual racist comment, something to assert his dominance and remind everyone who was in charge. But that moment had only solidified Eli's resolve. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who had been silently enduring this treatment for years. Eli had stayed calm, pushing back with quiet confidence, knowing that it would be the first step in dismantling the false power Brad had built for himself. And then there was the sabotage. Brad's attempt to undermine Eli by feeding him false data was a desperate move, one that revealed just how threatened Brad had felt. Eli could have fought back immediately, exposed Brad's manipulation in the moment, but he had chosen to play the long game. He had allowed Brad to think he had won, only to reveal the truth when the time was right. That moment, the announcement of Eli as CEO, had been the turning point. The look on Brad's face, the shock, the disbelief, it was all Eli needed to confirm that he had made the right decisions. Brad's downfall wasn't about personal revenge. It was about showing the company that the era of manipulation and sabotage was over. But even with Brad gone, Eli knew his work was far from done. Walton Industries wasn't just about one toxic manager. It was about a culture that had allowed people like Brad to thrive for so long. Eli's role now was to rebuild that culture, to foster an environment where employees felt valued, respected, and empowered. He thought of the conversations he'd had with Sarah and others in HR. They had known for years what was going on, but they hadn't had the power to make real change. Now, with Eli in charge, they had an opportunity to reshape the company from the inside out. It wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about setting new standards for how people treated one another, how leaders led, and how talent was nurtured rather than stifled. Eli's gaze shifted to the plans on his desk, the initiatives he had begun outlining. His first priorities were clear: transparency, accountability, and respect. He wanted to implement an open-door policy where employees could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. He wanted to establish leadership training programs to ensure that those in management positions weren't just skilled at their jobs, but also skilled at leading people. And most importantly, he wanted to create a culture of fairness, where people were promoted based on merit, not on who they knew or how well they played corporate games. He sighed softly, the weight of his new role settling on his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy. Change never was. There would be resistance, especially from those who had benefited from the old way of doing things. But Eli was ready for it. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, learning the ins and outs of the company from the ground up. Now, as CEO, he had the power to make the changes Walton Industries so desperately needed. Eli's mind wandered to the people who had helped him along the way. Sarah had been a key ally, quietly providing him with information and insight without ever asking for recognition. She, like many others, had wanted change for years, but hadn't known how to make it happen. Eli promised himself he would reward that loyalty, not with titles or empty promotions, but by creating the kind of workplace where people like Sarah could thrive. And then there was Jim. Eli hadn't forgotten the trust that Jim Hartman had placed in him. Jim had built Walton Industries from the ground up, but even he had recognized that the company needed new leadership to survive in the modern world. Eli owed it to Jim to ensure that Walton Industries not only survived, but thrived under his leadership. As the last rays of the sunset disappeared over the horizon, Eli felt a sense of quiet determination. This was his moment. The groundwork had been laid, and now it was time to build something new, something better. The company was in his hands, and Eli was ready to lead it into a future defined by integrity, respect, and accountability. The era of manipulation and sabotage was over. A new beginning had arrived.